It's your big return to the UFC. Conor, what's happening?
Ready to rock, my man. 5 years out of the game, and I'm back. I'm
You
excited
are?
to get back.
In November of 2024, a high court in Dublin found Conor McGregor liable for the sexual assault of Nikita Hand in a hotel room in December 2018 and awarded her just under €250,000 in damages. Hand, a mother of one, testified that McGregor assaulted her at the Beacon Hotel in Sandyford and that McGregor wouldn't take no for an answer. Despite having a wife and son at home, McGregor admitted to the sexual encounter, but just denied that it was non-consensual. He described the affair as fully consensual, vigorous, and athletic, and claimed that he had not caused the bruising later photographed on her. The most vile piece of evidence in this case was that the tampon Hand was using at the time had become wedged at the top of her vagina, which Dr. Daniel Kane of the Rotunda Sexual Assault Treatment Unit had to remove with forceps. Kane also testified that he found a possible internal vaginal tear and documented a multiplicity of injuries that he classified as moderate to severe. He concluded that his findings were consistent with the account she gave. On top of that, the intense bruising Hand had on all four limbs was described by paramedic Ethna Scully as the worst she'd seen in a long time. Hand's account was unequivocal. She testified that while she was heavily intoxicated, he pinned her, choked her 3 times, and assaulted her, that she froze, thought of her daughter, and thought she was going to die. The memory gaps she acknowledged were about peripheral parts of the night, not the assault itself. I say this because the UFC fan base is quick to dismiss his entire trial as a case of he said, she said, where McGregor's biggest sin was drinking, cheating, and all around putting himself in a position where he would behave in an ungodly manner. These supposedly unbiased individuals cite that Hand stating she couldn't recall certain details about the rest of the night, Hand's friend Danielle Keeley stating that she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, and CCTV footage of Hand being amicable with McGregor after the assault as damning evidence of her unreliability. They do this because it makes it a little easier for them to cheer on MMA's largest attraction if his biggest slight was hedonism, rather than sexual assault. The narrative that vindictive women are hunting down young athletes to put in precarious situations where they can then sue for sexual assault and make a quick buck from the proceedings is an extremely popular one within male-dominated sports, and it makes sense why. The male fans of these athletes who often idolize or vilify them to a parasocial extent aren't in the business of questioning why so many of their favorite stars are predators, so they shift the blame towards the victims. In reality, Hand being intoxicated is key evidence for her case. A person that drunk could never consent to sex. Danielle Keeley was in another hotel room having sex with one James Lawrence at the time of the assault, and her testimony was about the brief moment when McGregor and Hand emerged, not about anything she observed happening behind the door. The validity of the CCTV footage leans on the erroneous belief that a real victim would be visibly shattered on camera. Victims routinely appear calm, functional, and even friendly right after, especially when heavily intoxicated and in shock. Her being extremely drunk is undisputed. Her own boyfriend feared that she'd fall asleep and not remember. Appearing amicable in a lift is the behavior of someone drunk and not yet processing, not a sign of consent. The physical evidence also just outranks the footage entirely. To dismiss the awful bruising and vaginal injuries, you'd have to come up with conspiracy theories that suggest this heavily intoxicated woman either inflicted wounds on herself that lined up with her account of the assault, or that she ran into a third party after the encounter, who then proceeded to commit the actual assault. McGregor's defense did actually try to argue this, but the jury that found him liable wasn't buying it. Not to mention that McGregor testified that no tampon was present in his version of the events. Liable is the keyword of this entire proceeding, because the case was settled civilly. McGregor was not actually criminally convicted for the assault of Nikita Hand, because the standards required to convict for a crime like this are higher than the evidence that was presented. It's a flaw of judicial systems everywhere that we'd essentially need CCTV footage of the assault itself for criminal charges to even be pursued. The fact that Conor McGregor isn't in prison right now does not point towards his innocence. Oftentimes, public and private figures who are predators behind closed doors will maintain an outward persona of benevolence. It covers their tracks when they pounce, if most people believe they aren't capable of committing such an act. But what's interesting in McGregor's case is that he has a documented history of assault, sexual misconduct, debauchery, cheating, legal troubles, and a verbal disdain for being a decent human being. The rap sheet speaks for itself. In April 2018, he was arrested and charged with 3 counts of assault and a felony count of criminal mischief after throwing a metal dolly through the window of a bus full of fighters at the Barclays Center, injuring 2 of them. He pled down to a disorderly conduct violation, community service, and anger management classes. In 2019, he was filmed sucker punching a man in his 50s at a Dublin pub. He copped a guilty plea and was fined €1,000. In 2020, he was detained for 2 days in Corsica over an allegation of attempted sexual assault and indecent exposure, and was released without charge. In October of 2021, he was accused by Italian television presenter Francesco Fascinetti of breaking his nose with an unprovoked punch in Rome. No charges followed. In the summer of 2022, a woman alleged she assaulted her aboard his yacht in Ibiza. No charges followed. In June 2023, a woman alleged he sexually assaulted her in a bathroom during Game 4 of the NBA Finals in Miami. Prosecutors declined to bring criminal charges, but her civil suit is still working through the courts. In other words, Conor McGregor is exactly the type of person you would expect to sexually assault someone. And here he is on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, during the lead up to his big return fight against Max Holloway at UFC 329, like nothing ever happened. Not only is he being embraced once again by the larger American media landscape, the UFC, and even its fan base, which has spent the last 5 years fervently turning on McGregor for his conduct and generally cans for his presence within the sport of MMA, has seemingly accepted him back with open arms. At worst, that fervent rebellion has curdled into simple indifference. Their biggest concern is whether or not McGregor will actually step foot in the cage this time. And of course, if McGregor manages to return in fantastic form and rise from the ashes like a proverbial phoenix, all that depravity will be reduced to mere noise within his greater story. Like with Jon Jones before him and Gable Steveson after him, simply being good at the sport of mixed martial arts will be enough for the UFC fanbase not just to forgive his past slights, but to canonize them as essential adversity within McGregor's story. What kind of environment creates this level of success and admiration for the worst people in the world? On New Year's Eve of 2022, Dana White, the president and public face of the UFC for a quarter of a century, was filmed slapping his wife in a nightclub in Cabo. This is the same Dana White who spent years telling every camera he would come across that there is never ever an excuse for a man to put his hands on a woman, a line he deployed whenever a fighter's arrest hit the news and he needed to sound like a moral authority. When the hands were his own, he issued an apology.
Any questions?
I was going to ask you. We're taking questions. I guess the big question that everybody wants to know. Like you said, no excuses. Full apologies. And I like your statement there that it shouldn't be defended at all. But are there going to be any repercussions? Are there any repercussions planned from the company or self-imposed repercussions?
Yeah. Well, what should the repercussions be? You tell me. I take 30 days off. How does that hurt me?
Nothing happened to him, and nothing was ever going to happen to him. There were no standards for the men at the top, and the actual truth of the organization became apparent, which is that consequences exist in inverse proportion to your value. Jon Jones spent 15 years as living proof of this. This is a man plenty of people will tell you is the greatest mixed martial artist of all time, including Dana White. A lot. He tested positive for cocaine before a title fight, and the fight went ahead anyway. He crashed into a pregnant woman's car and broke her arm, fled the scene on foot, and came back only to grab cash out of his own vehicle before running again. He failed drug test after drug test. He was arrested in 2020, driving drunk with an open bottle and a handgun in the car. And in September of 2021, just hours after the UFC formally inducted him to the Hall of Fame, he was arrested in Las Vegas after his fiancée was found bleeding from the mouth. An arrest he punctuated by headbutting the hood of the police car. Dana White's full public reckoning with all of it was to observe that Jon has a lot of demons. The UFC then brought him back, handed him the heavyweight title, and let him retire in 2025 as a canonized legend, whose demons are now a chapter in his mythology. Which brings us back to UFC 329. So to take stock of the evening the UFC has assembled, the main event is a man a jury found responsible for sexual assault. The celebrated debut is a man once arrested on suspicion of the same crime. The blueprint for both the redemption arcs was drawn by the greatest fighter the company ever promoted, whose Hall of Fame induction and domestic violence arrest happened on the same day, and the whole show answers to a president who was filmed slapping his wife, and correctly determined that nothing on earth would happen to him for it, because the UFC doesn't have a predator problem. It operates a business model that makes predators a product. The worst part of all this is what it steals from the sport itself. In my last video, I made the case that Mona Kimura, the most violent woman in kickboxing, cannot become whole as a martial artist until she shares a ring with contender Sofia Solikidu, because a fighter only grows when somebody forces the growth. That's the actual point of all this. The opponent as the whetstone. The UFC understands none of this, or more accurately, it understands all of that, and has calculated that it doesn't really sell. Somewhere along the way, the fighters stopped being martial artists and became content, disposable characters in a promotion that pays them somewhere between 13 and 18 cents of every dollar it generates. The UFC is nearly as responsible for McGregor's deeds as he is. The UFC fed him, marketed him, protected him, and enriched him. He's the machine's finished work, and at UFC 329, they will attempt to twist the tale of redemption. If you want to support work like this directly, the Patreon is linked in the description, and every cent of it goes back to the channel. This video is an abridged version of a script that had to be cut down for time tremendously. So if you want to read a complete version of Conor McGregor's career timeline, consider becoming a Blue Bell. Thank you.